here at Northwestern.
And sorry, it's recording now.
Yeah. And now I'm still at Northwestern. I'm finishing up my PhD, so I should finish within the next year or so. And I actually switched. I'm no longer really within biomechanics. I switched to pain and computational neuroscience. But I'm still very much in touch with the biomechanics world, and I still love biomechanics. And this is kind of what the focus of the talk is more related to. And so I have published quite a bit, especially for a graduate student. I think Anna mentioned on Twitter, I have over 50 publications. And I was kind of surprised that you guys wanted me to speak about this, because the paper I'm going to speak about, it's not really like a standard paper. So when you're in graduate school or when you're an undergrad, you might be like a research assistant if you're an undergrad, or if you're in graduate school, you're working on a thesis or dissertation, and there's the typical like, oh, during your first year or two, you might write a review paper, which serves as like chapter 1 of your dissertation. Or most of your studies go in terms of, oh, you have a hypothesis that you and your advisor come up with, you collect data, you publish, and you kind of iterate on that standard process. If you're a research assistant, you usually just help with ongoing projects and you become part of the publishing machine in a sense. But there are less conventional approaches to publishing that especially a lot of senior PIs are a part of, and that's kind of writing critical reviews, commentaries, hypothesis papers, even letters. And these are kind of like higher level think pieces in a sense. So you're not contributing original data, you're just putting together things you've read, things you've thought about, and publishing them so the broader community can kind of integrate it into their knowledge, think about it, start discussion at least. And I think this discussion is kind of underappreciated when you're in graduate school, but I really think it's kind of the basis of new knowledge. Like getting new ideas into the literature is kind of imperative for moving science forward. So you can be a part of that without collecting new data. And that's kind of what I did here. So if you look in the exercise science literature, you'll see claims like this. So this is from an EMG study. And what they did is they looked at an exercise and measured EMG of that exercise under different loads. And you can see in the good morning exercise, heavier loads may provide a more potent training stimulus due to both an increase in total muscle activation. So this is EMG activity and torque requirements. And this is problematic for what I'll get into in the actual discussion, but it's all over the literature. And I'll address the elephant in the room is that I'm very guilty of this. I've published several papers that either explicitly state this. So what that quote was actually from my first paper that I published when I was a senior in undergrad. And several other papers at least imply this type of conclusion. So greater EMG activity an exercise has greater EMG activity, therefore it'll produce greater benefits. So be it muscle growth, strength, maybe in the rehab setting, especially they think strength is pretty important. But I think I've since grown wiser from my late undergrad, early grad school days. And I've published a number of papers. So 2 of these are letters to the editors. And 2 of these, this was a big review paper that we published back in 2018. And this is the paper we just published. And this paper is very general, and we go over kind of the specifics of what surface EMG amplitudes tell you, what they don't tell you, what inferences you can make, what inferences you can't make, so on and so forth. And we noticed this paper was being cited a ton, but for the wrong reasons. So people were just saying, oh yeah, this is like a limitation of EMG, so it may not specifically imply what we're saying it implies. But the problem was that what we were saying in this paper kind of undermined the entire premise of their study, but they were still citing it as a mere limitation. So we were discussing a fatal flaw that they just kind of brushed off. So we wrote this more strongly worded paper, and that's what I'm gonna focus on today. And first, I think it's important to understand what surface EMG is, especially the biophysics of it. So You get an action potential from the motor neuron, and that goes to the muscle. And then you get an action potential that travels across the sarcolemma. And as that travels across the sarcolemma, you have a, let's say, a bipolar electrode, and then it'll detect the potential difference. And that's what you get as the surface EMG. And then you can take the, you can rectify this and then take the average, or you can do a root mean square. You can do something to get an amplitude of these action potentials. But obviously in a muscle, you get a whole bunch of these and they sum to what you observe on the surface, which is what they call the interference EMG. And surface EMG is used in a ton of applications. So like here's a paper from Carlo De Luca with decomposition. So they measure EMG in the muscle and then they kind of decompose that into the actual spike trains of the individual motor units. People use it on a higher level, so studying things like muscle synergies or motor modules to understand how you coordinate during gait or some reaching task or things like that. So it's a very high level method. And also even things like the neural origins of force loss. So this is like with stretching, I think it was. And you can use measured EMG and normalize it to M wave. And basically the idea here is that force loss is proportional to the change in normalized EMG. So then the force loss that comes from acute stretching comes from a change in the neural drive to the muscle and not necessarily the intrinsic properties of the muscle. And like I said, it's commonly used to imply hypertrophy. And that's for several reasons. And I don't think it's that authors are malicious or anything like that. I think they have good reasons to use surface EMG for this reason. And I think the first is that it's convenient, especially if you have a master's student, they need to produce a paper. Running a training study is a huge inconvenience. It takes weeks or months. People have to come in repeatedly, so you have adherence issues. Whereas with a surface EMG study, people come in once and you're done. So that covers that. In addition, publishing is incentivized, so it's much easier to carry out an acute study than it is a longitudinal study. And most importantly, people believe it's informative. So there's this implicit logic that increased surface EMG amplitude should imply hypertrophy. It's rarely said explicitly, but I think number 4 is really the impetus behind things. So if nobody's going to use this technology to imply hypertrophy if they don't believe it's informative. And so what we did was we kind of deconstructed this logic into a series of premises and a logical conclusion. So I'm sure you've seen this kind of this pathway before. So neuromuscular excitation leads to muscle activation, which leads to cross-bridge attachment, and then you have force production. So there's this mechanistic pathway. And what you have here is surface EMG amplitude is supposed to represent the neuromuscular excitation of the muscle. And note that neuromuscular excitation here is not the same as muscle activation. So muscle activation has to do with calcium binding to troponin in the muscle, whereas neuromuscular activation has to do with the action potentials traveling down the motor neuron, and then the action potential that you get in the muscle itself. So traveling over the sarcolemma. So we separate these constructs. And perhaps made more explicitly, the logic is this. Surface EMG is a proxy for muscle excitation. Muscle excitation leads to muscle activation. Activation leads to force. Force triggers muscle protein synthesis. Protein synthesis builds muscle. Therefore, greater surface EMG amplitudes imply greater hypertrophy. So it's a pretty simple logical argument. But I think it really needs to be evaluated. And that was the goal of our paper. And we can do so by stepping through each of the premises and looking at experimental data to see whether they support those premises. And this is, I think, one of the simplest but most interesting studies in the surface EMG literature. And it's really simple. So what they did was they put a grid of electrodes over the tibialis anterior, and they did a and they stimulated the fibular nerve. And when you stimulate a nerve, what happens is you get two readouts on the EMG. The first readout is what you call an M wave. So that action potential travels from the nerve to the muscle, and then it excites the muscle. And that's the M wave. And then there's another action potential that travels up the motor neuron, and it synapses in the spinal cord, and it comes back down, and that's called the H wave. So what we're looking at here is the M wave. So it's not affected by anything in the central nervous system. It's just you're stimulating the nerve and reading it in the muscle. And then they did this in 3 different ankle positions, so dorsiflexion, neutral, and plantar flexion. So you have the same exact input to the muscle, but what you get are drastically different EMG amplitudes. So with a stimulation intensity of 50%, the amplitude when you're in plantar flexion is half the amplitude of when you're in dorsiflexion. And similarly, with 100% stimulation intensity, this is probably 2/3 of what it is in dorsiflexion. I mean, this in my mind was like boggling. Like I knew muscle length affected EMG readouts, but this is showing the effect you could have double the EMG amplitude if you change a muscle position. And that's a huge bias that, I mean, we talk about the effect of muscle length, but I was thinking before I saw this study, oh, it's probably 5–10% or so, but I never imagined it would be this large. So this is a very salient finding that I think undermines this premise that an increase in surface EMG implies an increase in muscle excitation. Or at the very least, it shows that you need to control for position. And this has been known for a while. So this is a quote from a paper from 1982, and they observed something similar. So this was on the tibialis anterior, and they said it was recognized that a change in EMG when a new joint angle was chosen might simply reflect the alteration in the geometric relationship between the motor unit generators within the muscle belly, so the muscle fibers and the sarcolemma, and the surface recording electrodes. An allowance is made for this effect by measuring the changes in the rectified and average TA M wave following maximal stimulation of the peroneal nerve. It was found that the M wave response measured in this way usually changed by an amount proportional to the alteration in EMG activity. In other words, their effect of ankle position was wholly due to the change in the geometry of the tibialis anterior and not the change in actual excitation of the muscle itself. And the reason that occurs, in case you're curious, so we're reading things on the muscle level, the action potentials are always going along the directions of the fibers, right? But when you change your muscle length, pennation angle changes. And so those action potentials are now traveling in a totally different direction. And when you're picking them up in space, so the amplitude of the more superficial fiber will be greater than the amplitude of the deeper fiber. So that's going to create a bias in how you read things. And here's another reason. So in this study, they looked at isometric bench press, and they looked at different parts of the pectoralis major. So 2 different positions, and then a bunch of different places along the pectoralis major. And when you use EMG, you see, or at least with an array of EMG, you can see what's called the innervation zone. And when an action potential comes into the muscle, it goes to the motor unit end plate, and then the action potentials travel in either direction along the muscle fiber. And so that's what you're seeing here. That's why, so the action potential is going this way and the action potential is going this way, which is why they're also opposite in polarity. But when you change positions, the electrodes stay on one position, but the muscle moves underneath. So that means the innervation zone shifts. So by changing positions, you're also changing what you're reading under the electrode. So again, especially if you're relying on something like bipolar electrodes, that can also bias your measurement. So again, it kind of goes against this premise if you're not controlling for joint position. This is a pretty well-known study, and this really shows the effect of velocity. So people are doing biceps curls, and you have the change in joint angle, and then This line is the velocity. So you have concentric, eccentric, so on and so forth. And what you see is, yes, there's an effective position in a sense, but the effective velocity is much larger. So this curve you see with a concentric contraction, as you speed up, the EMG amplitude is higher than when you're eccentric, the EMG amplitude is very low. So again, there's not only a length problem, but also a velocity problem. And there are also more theoretical concerns. So this is from our 2018 paper. And if you have a muscle that recruits from deep to superficial, that's going to show a totally different relationship with force than a muscle that's superficial to deep. So this is going to bias what you get with the electrode, and then you can't really compare between muscles, if that makes sense. So I would contend, does increased surface EMG amplitude imply greater muscle excitation? Not necessarily. So there are many situations where it doesn't. And the biases from changes in muscle length, fiber velocity, recruitment strategy, biochemical environment in the case of fatigue, there are many variables that play into and alter the biophysics of the signal that this entire literature kind of just ignores. So moving on, we also have activation, right? So let's assume EMG perfectly measures muscle excitation. Can we say anything about activation? And to understand that, we have to consider the activation dynamics of a muscle. And so what that means is when you excite the sarcolemma of a muscle, you release calcium, and that calcium enables myosin to bind to actin, right? By moving the troponin. And so this process is a slower process than electricity traveling over the course of the muscle, and there's a time lag. So what that means is there's a transfer function that relates excitation to activation, and that's a differential equation. So this history dependence will play an important role in dynamic situations. So if you're changing excitation over time, or if you're changing muscle length, this will start to play a role. So that means you can dynamically uncouple excitation from activation. But if you're looking at something like an isometric contraction, something that's non-fatiguing, things will be much more controlled, and you can probably assume that this relationship is true. So if the system is stationary, yes, it's probably a safe assumption. But if the system's not stationary, it's probably not a safe assumption. But again, with a lot of exercises aren't stationary. So in that case, that assumption is violated. Then you have to go from activation to force, because it's assumed that muscle force leads to muscle protein synthesis. And for that, you have to consider the muscle contraction dynamics. So we have this typical force velocity and length tension relationship that we're all very familiar with. And when considering that, you can have different activations that produce the same force. So for example, if you have a longer muscle length, you might have to have a 100% activation to get the same amount of force as, let's say, 70% activation at an optimal fiber length. So I think this is something that biomechanists are fairly competent with, but in the physiologists, at least in my experience, sometimes forget this relationship and the importance that it can play in understanding the measurements they're making with EMG. So they'll try to infer from EMG that it means that that's the force the muscle is producing. But as you know, you need a musculoskeletal model to kind of get at that. But if you have a non-fatiguing isometric condition, it's probably a safe assumption that greater surface EMG amplitude, or at least greater activation, will represent greater force. But if the muscle is changing length or fatiguing, that's not the case. Likewise, for increased muscle force, implying greater protein synthesis. So this is an experiment out of Stu Phillips' lab. And what they did is they had people perform different types of exercise. So this is 30%, so it's a really low load. This is work matched to a 90%. condition, and this is 30% if someone goes until they until they fail. So totally fatigued. And from a muscle protein synthesis standpoint, if you use 30% to failure, you get similar muscle protein synthesis response, at least acutely, to a 90% to failure. And then over the course of a day, it actually beats out the 90% to failure. But the point being that there are other variables that play into this relationship, and it's not simply that increased force leads to increased muscle protein synthesis. The amount of effort that you put forth in an exercise will greatly affect the acute processes that follow that exercise bout. And then we can see how this translates to hypertrophy. So ideally, the muscle protein synthesis measurement would imply hypertrophy, right? Like, of course, you need to synthesize protein to build muscle. And this is from a study from 2014, which was pretty shocking because they observed pretty much no correlation between, so this is a measure of muscle protein synthesis and then the change in muscle volume. But there was a follow-up study in 2016 in which they corrected for muscle damage. So the thing is, when you start to begin exercising, you get a ton of muscle damage. And so this will affect the muscle protein synthesis measurements. And this will, since with greater muscle damage, you tend to see greater muscle protein synthesis to try to make up for that muscle damage. But if you wait after that initial period, so like after the repeated bout effect kind of kicks in and the muscle doesn't get as damaged after exercise, then you see really strong relationships. So this in general is probably a safe assumption. Just you have to consider muscle damage. But there's a more salient point. So we just went through each of those different premises, and yeah, a lot of them don't hold on their own, but like, let's assume that they did hold. So if premise 1 held, premise 2 held, so on and so forth. So we could say that A correlates with B and B correlates with C, but that itself does not imply that A correlates with C. So correlations don't have a transitive property, and that can be described using, so this is from a book, How Not to Be Wrong. And what's really nice about this is a correlation is essentially a dot product between vectors, right? And so you can have vector 1 and vector 2 at a 45-degree angle. So that has a cosine of 0.7 or correlation of 0.7. 2 and 3, likewise, a correlation of 0.7, but 1 can be totally orthogonal to 3. So a correlation of 0.7 is pretty strong, but that's not transitive. So the point being, you need to actually validate surface-EMG as a predictor. So we can't just go off the premises alone. And there is some work that spans multiple premises. So we know surface-EMG isn't strongly correlated with muscle activation. So here they used measures of changes in glycogen content. Activation isn't strongly correlated with anabolic signaling. So you need anabolic signaling for muscle protein synthesis. Surface-EMG isn't strongly correlated with anabolic signaling, but it seems to yield different signals in conditions that yield higher versus lower muscle protein synthesis. So basically, you can have a condition that has greater surface-EMG, but doesn't have greater muscle protein synthesis. Activation is not necessary for growth. So this is a classic study where all they did was they stretched muscle fibers and they grew. So you don't even need to activate the muscle to do that. And then you can also have identical input to a muscle and produce different hypertrophic outcomes. So what this study did was they sent the same excitation to muscles, but one group was kept isometric and the other group was allowed to contract dynamically. And the isometric group grew more. And then there's also indirect evidence. So in favor of surface-EMG implying hypertrophy, you have like a single versus multi-joint. So for example, in single joint exercises, so consider like a knee extension, you see a ton of excitation of the rectus femoris, or in a hamstring curl, you see a ton of excitation of the hamstrings. Whereas for a multi-joint exercise like a squat or a leg press, you see really low excitation in these exercises. And that seems to carry over to the hypertrophy research. Although I'd contend you can kind of infer that from basic biomechanics. Like, it's probably not the case that the rectus femoris is going to be doing much in a squat or a multi-joint exercise. But then you have all of these kind of counterexamples. So if you compare eccentric and concentric, surface EMG doesn't seem to imply greater hypertrophy. If you have fatiguing conditions, for example, high load versus low load taken to failure, high load almost always has greater EMG amplitudes, but they seem to have very similar hypertrophy in the long run. Comparing different muscle lengths, so like typically shorter lengths produce greater surface EMG amplitudes due to the effect we discussed earlier, but greater muscle lengths typically create greater adaptations. And there's also some work with T2 MRI, although I'd contend, number one, that's not a measurement of EMG and it hasn't been validated the way that people are trying to use it. And also their statistical models don't really answer the questions that the authors claim. That's another discussion. So wrapping up, the assumption that surface EMG amplitudes are predictive of hypertrophy, it's really based on weak premises, and from that sense, it's a slippery slope. So what I mean by that is an argument is only as strong as its weakest premise. And so if you have a ton of weak premises, that's a really weak argument. With or without weak premises, the direct claim hasn't been rigorously tested. So like, even if these premises did seem to hold and did seem to hold strongly, we would still need direct evidence for this. So ideally, people actually validating models suggesting that surface EMG is predictive in the long term. And again, indirect evidence is kind of equivocal, but the fact that it's equivocal suggests that we can't just flat out use surface EMG. Like, there are at least counterexamples. Therefore, at the very least, there are boundary conditions to predictive validity. And it also doesn't say that surface EMG cannot inform us. It's just that the premises are weak and we don't have good evidence. So I don't think there's a whole lot of promise, but there may be situations where it's extremely useful. And in those situations where it's useful, that's great. We can save the time doing really long training studies. So in conclusion, be critical. Like, this is an entire literature. Like, it's very easy to find papers on this topic. And in my mind, the entire literature just kind of assumes that this is correct, but their conclusions are based on assumptions. They're not based on evidence. So you really have to boil down, like, what is the author's logic? What assumptions are they making? Because those assumptions are based into that logic, and those assumptions may not be explicit. And then you have to go through and actually see what assumptions are reasonable and supported. Some things may be reasonable, like at face value, but then you look into it and really try to understand what's going on, and maybe they're not as supported as you would have thought. And that's also happened in medicine many times, where you have some intervention that should work based on what we know about the physiology. And maybe a lot of basic work would suggest that it works, but then they carry out a massive RCT and it either doesn't work or it's actually harmful to patients. So same idea there. But also, I mean, I'm just a graduate student, right? Like, this is a whole literature of a bunch of people with PhDs and big shot professors pumping out a ton of papers. And I just kind of went in and wrote a couple of really critical papers, and they're kind of making a splash. Like, you don't have to be a big name to really have an influence on the field. You just have to read critically, think about things deeply. And there's no reason you can't write papers and really contribute to the literature and push fields forward. Because without this critical discussion, how are fields going to move forward? So write papers, be bold. So I'd like to acknowledge some of my co-authors on these. So Israel, Gabriel, and Tyan were on the last paper I mentioned, the most recent one. And Greg was on the 2018 review paper. But they were hugely helpful, and they also span multiple fields. So you get multiple viewpoints when writing the paper, which I think is really helpful for communicating. And that's it. I really blew through that, I think, but thank you all. I hope that was somewhat informative and not just esoteric.
Yeah, no, I know I learned a lot, which is good because I might have to use EMG soon. So, well, I guess as the name suggests, we did want it to be questions based. So Andrew has shared a lot about what he's done, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or write them in the chat, or if you'd like me to ask them, write them in the chat to me and I will ask them. Yeah, so any questions?
Can I pitch one at you? This is a super practical question. So I've never had a super high opinion of surface EMG other than to be able to tell me if a muscle's turned on or off at a particular time. But I'm wondering about how that manifests in the world of EMG driven models, and whether you can only think about activation, onset, offset, or whether you could actually be using the EMG amplitude in some concrete way that might actually be helpful, and what the sort of the watch outs are from your perspective.
So from that perspective, I mean, I haven't done EMG informed modeling. I know it's a pretty deep literature in and of itself, but yeah, I would tend to agree with you that the onset offset is probably the safest thing, especially for like model verification. As for using the actual amplitudes themselves, I would say it depends what you're doing, right? Like with the more dynamic things are, the less I would trust those amplitudes to really inform the activation, especially with all the effects with muscle length changes. Like, I don't know, in my mind, if you have the same input and like double the amplitude for a different muscle, just because the muscle length changed, I don't know how you can use that to inform a model. Like, but I think, so I was originally thinking about doing some of my dissertation work on that idea. Like, can we actually understand this relationship from first principles? And then can we correct some of those things in kind of post-processing? And if we could do that, I think it could make surface EMG a much more useful tool. But I think we're a ways off.
I guess along those lines, I was wondering if there was any sort of normalizing technique that you liked or preferred, or from what you've seen you'd recommend, because I hear about maximum voluntary contractions a lot, and that, as I understand it, when you take those, the muscle length shouldn't be changing, and then everybody's would be taken in the same position. But when you showed how much the TA changes length, right, you go through past that range of motion just in walking. So I was just sort of wondering if you think there might be a scheme to use those.
Yeah, so I think it's very study dependent. So one thing we did mention in our paper is like there may be, you may have seen somewhere like position specific normalization, and that might be a bit better because it would kind of overcome some of those things, or at least in theory it should. You could also do M-wave at different positions, but it really depends on what you're looking to get from the EMG and what your tasks are and what's going on. But yeah, I definitely think that's something to be cognizant about. Otherwise, like you might get a huge underestimation of the relative excitation just because you took the MVC in, like, let's say a really short position. But yeah, there could be a lot of neural drive to that muscle that you just don't get to pick up. And likewise, the other way around, right? Like, I remember there was a study where they looked at, what was it? They were looking at gluteus maximus EMG, and I think they normalized to like a step up position, like in hip flexion. So in hip flexion is when the gluteus maximus gets the lowest EMG. So then everything that they did after that was like
really high.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and even I really liked what you were saying about the muscle to muscle too. Like, how do we really know that one's higher than the other one? That one definitely made me think, just based on a lot of stuff that I've seen. Like, do we really know that is the muscle pattern? Shapes. Yeah. do we really know that is the muscle pattern? And do we really know? I don't know. It made me wonder.
I almost wonder then about comparing potentially different activities. So you could potentially be normalizing to an MVIC or normalizing to the highest millivoltage that they see during a trial, but say somebody is doing two completely different things, then you almost wonder, like if somebody was walking versus somebody was taking steps up versus someone who was taking steps down, you almost wonder, is that completely like nonsense basically?
I mean, yeah, it could be artifact, like if you're, yeah, because one of those is biased so that the muscle's in a longer position versus a shorter position, right? And so if you're just comparing two different muscle positions, it's really hard to say whether that's due to the actual input. Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Sure. Yeah, it's a bit bleak, I suppose, not knowing this information and then hearing all of that. You kind of take back some of the thoughts you might have had about surface-EMG.
Yeah, and I think like, so I learned this stuff slowly over time, and I mostly learned it on my own, or like just reaching out to a few experts. But it was really kind of shocking, like in undergrad and really early grad school, I had very different thoughts. And then, I don't know, I guess it just made me really cynical after learning more about the signal itself. And I'm guessing that's the case with a lot of different areas. Like the more you get into things, the more you realize the limitations of the measurement. And then, yeah, it really makes you tamper your conclusions.
Yeah. I mean, possibly on the glass is half full kind. At least MVCs are like they're a pain to collect anyway. So if it turns out they're totally useless, we might as well just go for on and off. I guess I'm saying this on the recording, but I would stand by that if you run into me at the conference. Like, I mean, if we're looking for a silver lining, and then it probably also really matters, or maybe perhaps a better one would be that you should do MVCs in whatever activity you're doing. Like, I'm not exactly sure how you would do that, but they
Yeah,
should.
so going over the entire range of motion essentially and doing a position specific
Yeah,
normalization.
so you could do it that way for sure. But
Yeah,
then
you could probably just like put them in a dynamometer and like
Yeah.
do a bunch of different positions or really slowly going through the range of motion.
Yeah.
But to kind of put a damper on that, the on-off perspective.
Oh no.
So there's a lot of talk about crosstalk with EMG, right? Everybody's scared of crosstalk. And to kind of compensate for that, what a lot of companies have done is they made their inter-electrode distance really small. So that cuts down on signal from other areas. But as a result, the EMG might not be representative of the entire muscle since its pickup volume is smaller. So it could be that your electrode is on the middle of the muscle or more on the proximal part of the muscle or something, and there's something on the distal part of the muscle that you're kind of missing. So you could view it as like a type 2 error instead of a type 1 error in terms of the muscle being on.
Yeah.
And
Dagger.
yeah, so there are some papers on that. Tyan Vieira's group out of Torino has published quite a bit in that area. But from that perspective, I do think the EMG arrays and EMG grids will be hugely helpful. But right now they're just so expensive and not a lot of labs have them. Like, I understand it's kind of it's a bummer, but at least things are getting better.
I guess it could be right question dependent for sure. I mean, as everything is, but right, like if sort of that, right, it needs to be as simple as possible, but no simpler. So only make it as complicated as it needs to be. If you're okay with, well, the belly of the muscle, is it really turned on or is something else going on in part of it, right? Maybe you're most confident on the on off if you did get something, if you're okay with the crosstalk or whatever. And I know that the one that I'm putting it on for, we haven't looked at it very much yet. It's definitely right. We've got a muscle that's responsible for dorsiflexion, a muscle that's responsible for plantar flexion, and then similarly, quad and hamstring. And so, right, it's, if you're close, that's going to be something to, and we mostly have it on to look at when we start getting muscle answers out of a model. Are those even approaching the ballpark of like, are they turned on at the right time?
Yeah,
so-
and with that, I'm not sure if you'd end up getting like, it depends how precise you want to be, I guess. Like, I'm not sure that the type 2 errors will be horrible if you're interested in like huge excitations.
Hmm.
Whereas I'm guessing with gait, you're not interested in like really subtle
Yeah.
differences.
I've been sort of wondering on like which muscles, like you don't get a lot of fine motor skill at the knee, right? Like where are those, like the parts of muscles going to fire? And I admit it's been 2 years since I took the muscle biomechanics class. So I remember that curve now that you've put it up there, but it took me a moment. The muscle is sort of, it fires all over the place, and sort of then it all goes, like gets blurred together for sure by the time you get to the outside.
Yeah, I mean, there are some perspectives on like intramuscular heterogeneities. So is the distal part of the muscle doing something functionally different than the proximal part of the muscle?
Okay.
And I think that's a pretty interesting area, but it's relatively unexplored. But I know with like, I think it's the hamstrings, there are like 2 separate innervations to the hamstrings, for example. And like, yeah, so in that it's perfectly reasonable that the distal part is doing something totally different than the proximal part.
So Andrew, where does this lead you to next?
This, I need to finish my PhD, which is not in this field. So this is just kind of like a hobby for fun paper. Hey, Zoe. But yeah, we don't have any other papers planned that like directly follow this. We were thinking about putting our heads together and trying to come up with like what are actual designs that could assess this question of like predictive validity. I think it's really difficult because almost for any question you can come up with, there's always like something you could ask. So like you could control for muscle length, you could control for like the torque that they have to generate. You can control for all these different things, but there's always going to be some variable that's different, right? Like otherwise you're just comparing the same exact thing. And then what's the point? And then you have to wonder if that difference between the exercises, no matter how small it is, could somehow propagate to either some non-stationarity in the EMG or would just make things wash out in the hypertrophy study. So probably the best example of that would be like, there's this idea of internal versus external focus in the motor control literature. And basically like if you focus on the muscle versus if you focus on like pushing up, for example. So you tend to get greater surface EMG amplitudes with an internal focus, so focusing on the muscle. So then it stands to reason that that should produce greater hypertrophy. But as we saw with the high load versus low load stuff, like maybe if you just take the exercise to failure, it doesn't make a difference. So we do have some weak evidence that like internal focus is better for hypertrophy, but I don't know. There are always kind of questions about things and how to actually properly control for what could affect the outcomes. And I guess it's this trade-off between like ecological validity and internal validity.
So you showed this really great figure. I don't remember what slide it was on number wise, but it had kind of that comparison as you elongate the muscle that the innervation site changes with respect to the actual surface electrodes. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, yeah, this is great. So, I mean, obviously we know, and you have it labeled here, it's a 20 millimeter shift. So could this kind of technique be used in a model to account for elongation? If you take someone, you move them through what are the, minimum, maximum lengths of the muscle, and then we're going to actually go through an exercise. We know that as you elongate or shorten the muscle, the EMG is going to have some bias. And then could you use this shift over the course of that exercise or that movement to account for the elongation of the muscle? Or is that like not even close to what this is representing?
It's only part of it. So there's this other effect, which I can show you. Or actually there are two other effects. So this is one of them. So say you have a muscle fiber that runs from tendon to tendon, and let's say it's parallel with the surface EMG electrodes. And so we run a simulation. And so we get the different action potentials propagating from the motor end plate. But as you change position as you elongate the muscle, or as you shorten the muscle, the pennation angle will increase, right? So you have this change in pennation angle. And so what that does is it changes the amplitudes you measure on the surface as a result. And so it may make a difference. So that kind of correction for innervation zone might help in some muscles or for some of the bias, but bias will arise from changes in pennation angle. In addition, as the muscle diameter becomes thicker as you contract, that will change the frequency characteristics. So that will also change the amplitude itself. So you have right there alone is two other sources of bias. And this is suspected to be the bias that I presented in the earlier slide. Yeah, so that's where this bias is supposed to come from, the change in pennation angle, not the innervation zone.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. But I do agree with you that this higher resolution of measurement should enable us to come up with more ways to correct the amplitudes in general. It's just that innervation zone is just part of it. Like that's one of a few.
Zoe, I saw you unmute earlier. Did you have a question about the paper? I have non-paper related questions, but I figured that you could ask a paper related question first if you had one. Sorry.
I actually have a non-paper related question. So Andrew, how do you go about finding collaborators to work with on these kinds of like impactful papers that are like critical to the field?
I just email people. I mean, Twitter definitely helps quite a bit. I think like sometimes you write about something or you see someone write about something and you reach out to them and you start talking, you start emailing, and it just kind of builds up from there. Or you read somebody else's paper and you see them like hint at something and then you email them, and that kind of kicks things off as well. Also just like having friends who are interested in the same areas, like you have beers with them and then it just kind of ends up being this really long conversation about, meaning like it's not just one night of beers, it ends up turning into like months of discussion about this one topic. So yeah, it really depends, like it varies from paper to paper.
Thanks.
I guess it all comes back to just discussions about science.
My question towards the beginning, you had kind of cited some of the papers in which you were making the claim that you spent the rest of the talk kind of talking about how that may not be the most valid claim. I wonder how you go about maybe how you go about mentally, but also like what the product ends up looking like, of saying like, these papers that I published potentially aren't catching what I think that they're catching, basically. So not going so far as to saying like, oh, I need to retract everything that I've published on this topic, but like, what's the next step moving forward, realizing, oh shoot, maybe what we thought we concluded was not accurate.
Yeah, so in most of those papers, like the conclusion's kind of tacit. And that's the case in a lot of this literature in general. Like most people don't explicitly say that this is the case, but yeah, I mean, the data are still the data, that's fine. I guess I don't really care. I don't like, I mean, it's science. We just have to keep trying to be as correct as possible. And like, I was wrong in the past, I'm going to be wrong again, but we just have to move on and we have to keep building and we have to keep advancing the field. And that's not going to happen if we just get caught up in some conclusion we made 5 years ago.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. I guess I have more questions along this line, or along non-specifically paper related. Have you gotten responses from people that potentially, I don't know if you're calling people out in the papers necessarily, but have you gotten pushback, I suppose, from authors saying, no, you've got this wrong, I stand by my data, or that sort of thing, letters to the editor or whatnot on these kind of logic papers?
No, I don't think I've ever gotten a letter to the editor, actually. There was some guy who was going off in Italian about how he was thinking about writing a letter to the editor. And I mean, I looked at his recent publications and it's like 2021, like 3 papers on surface-EMG and different exercises and stuff like that. But I mean, some people are going to be mad. That's fine. I don't care if people are mad. If they have a principled argument, bring me the principled argument and we can discuss it.
But you haven't had any in that, I mean, in not even just calling you out, but a more rational like argument proposed and that sort of thing, in this sort of or response to your papers?
No, I mean, the fairest criticisms I've had are like, so we didn't include every single example of like what supports or what doesn't support surface-EMG. And like, there's one more recent one that supports surface-EMG. And I don't know, people were kind of upset that we weren't more optimistic about what can come. So it's not that they disagreed with our arguments per se, it's that it was written in a more pessimistic tone. Although, I mean, like, I think if you understand the biophysics of this, I don't see how optimistic you can be. And I mean, the people that tend to understand the biophysics tend to agree with me on that. I don't know many people that are like true EMG experts that disagree with that, but.
I don't know if you'd want to answer this question offline or not, but so you kind of said that this is not directly your dissertation work. How has that balance been between like, these kinds of interests? Like you're still producing papers and still contributing to science, but maybe not always exactly what your PI wants. I don't know if you have any things that you can say while we're recording still, but if you want to answer this after, that's fine too.
I mean, these are kind of papers that I do on the side, nights and weekends and stuff like that. That's what I do for fun, I guess. But I'm still doing my PhD, like I'm getting my work done in that aspect. I still get grants and produce papers, collect data. So, I mean, what can he say? And also in general, like, yeah, it's my job to do a PhD and finish my PhD, but it's also my job to like set up my career. And it's not like these papers are just like going into the trash. I mean, they do go on my CV. I do get citations for them. So from like a bibliometric perspective, as weird as that whole thing is, it will benefit my career in some respect. And I think PIs should kind of respect that. Or,
I have one more non-paper related question, which was, so I guess as a grad student, oftentimes, we get together in journal clubs, or we get together in, or maybe we're just thinking to ourselves, like, well, I don't really buy that, or, I don't know if the author's claims here are correct. So, like, how would you say that you went from thinking, this is a bit weak, maybe not, all the way up to, I'm going to actually put this in the record, I'm going to write a paper on that?
Yeah, so I guess there were the two papers, right? So there was that review paper from 2018, and there's the most recent one. The review paper from 2018 was largely like, so I sometimes write papers because I'm curious about things, and it's like my way to learn more about a topic. And that's kind of what that 2018 review paper was. So I really wanted to understand surface EMG more and the signal amplitudes, and because I was starting to realize, like, hey, some of these things that these studies state, like, we can't make those conclusions. So for example, a bunch of studies were saying you can't, we're trying to conclude differences in motor unit recruitment from just amplitudes alone. And so that's how I started digging into this. And then I just produced this massive review with a few others. And then when I saw that our review kept getting cited as a mere limitation rather than like a fatal flaw. And then over time, like, yeah, so that was over years. And then I'm just like, okay, let's, like, we need to say something stronger about this.
Sure, yeah, thanks.
So I guess when you, I don't know, I'm probably a bit more obsessive than many people. And like, when I think something's wrong, I don't like it, I get fired up and I write. So yeah, if you just get that burning passion that, yeah, this isn't right, and it's the scientific literature, the scientific record, the record should be correct. And that's kind of what sets me off.
Sure, I liked what you said. I just liked what you said when you said, when I want to learn something, I try to write a paper about it. That's like it kind of forces you to understand what's going on there. That's a really good tidbit.
Yeah, and I
kind of on
think
that
that's a,
note, sorry. Kind of on that note, do you recommend, you referenced a book that you'd read, the How Not to Be Wrong. Do you recommend that to your fellow PhD students? Or is that kind of just like you read it, you thought it was worth reading, and then you tossed it off? Is that a book you recommend?
yeah, I guess I don't really recommend too many books. I thought it was interesting, I guess. I mean, I really like the idea of thinking mathematically in general. So that book it's written by a mathematician, and it's just about how mathematical modeling and thinking about things mathematically can really like improve the decisions you make and the things you do. So from that standpoint, I would recommend that book. I think some of the concepts in there are probably elementary from a mathematical standpoint, but I think like there is a point where applying mathematics is a bit more than, it's like philosophical in a sense. And from that standpoint, I really like the link from like pure math to actually like, you can apply these to concrete concepts. So to answer your question, I guess, yeah, I do recommend it. I don't normally recommend it, but I would recommend it. And Danny, just getting back to what you were saying before, yeah, I think that's a really useful concept, especially for like early in your PhD when you're first like picking up whatever you're working with. But you're what, like a third year now or something?
Yeah, who knows? Fourth year, I think. Yeah, I don't really know. But I mean, writing things in general is a way to just, because you kind of think that you understand something, but if you were to say, well, how could I communicate this to somebody? Like, you really have to kind of understand it. And you kind of logically have to figure your way through it. So, but yeah, I'm getting up there in years, I suppose.
Preaching to the choir on that one. Awesome.
Just to extend off that, I also think like trying to write something for a very general audience. Like I recently had to write something, and like some of the people that are going to be reading it are like music professors and stuff. And I do like systems neuroscience. So like trying to write about what dopamine is for somebody that like hardly knows what a neuron is, that's, yeah. So I think that was really challenging, but really good too. So in general, breaking down concepts for others.
I had a fluids professor that liked to try and say, can you explain that to a 5th grader? If you can't, you don't know it. You might know more than they're going to pick up, but you can't tell them what it is. But yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I did want to try and be respectful of everyone's time. I know we started a little behind the hour. Are there any last questions? I'm going to stop the recording just so we've all